In popular discourse both IRL and on the Internet, it is pretty common to hear inaccurate claims about the history of early firearms, especially the belief that they were inferior to bows in most regards. However, while most of these statements come from amateurs, no offense, there are some that come from qualified historians, such as the late Russell Weigley, who was a famous American scholar of military history. Of course, military history is a broad subject, so the sheer stupidity, no offense again, in the following passage from his book The Age of Battles, The Quest for Decisive Warfare from Breitenfeld to Waterloo may be forgiven, given that early firearms is a somewhat niche topic. In range, accuracy, and penetrating power, early hand-carried firearms represented a drastic step backward from the longbow or the crossbow of the Middle Ages. The European continent's most renowned infantry of the Middle Ages, the Swiss pikemen, had the good fortune never to confront a strong force of English longbowmen in battle. If they had, the English archers would have mowed them down. But against the first firearms, the Swiss merely dropped to the ground while the bullets passed over their heads, then resumed the advance while the enemy reloaded. The regression in infantry missile firing was tolerated largely because a man could become acceptably adept in handling an arquebus or musket much more quickly than he could learn to handle a longbow or crossbow properly. Skill in archery usually required constant practice from early boyhood, and the decline of the English longbowmen was as much a social as a military phenomenon, involving the decline of England's independent agricultural yeomanry in the face of the first enclosure movement. Nonetheless, the superiority of the crossbow to early firearms has been estimated at 40-1, and because the longbow had a considerably more rapid rate of fire than the crossbow, its superiority would have been greater yet. There is honestly quite a lot to unpack in this excerpt. Note that throughout this post, I will be referring to muskets as synonymous with arquebuses, and I will also focus on the topic from a Western European perspective, given that this view is used in the passage. In range, accuracy, and penetrating power, early hand-carried firearms represented a drastic step backward from the longbow or the crossbow of the Middle Ages. First of all, even most defenders of the longbow agree that early firearms were generally better than longbows at armor penetration based on their sheer advantage in kinetic energy, so it is quite strange to hear someone argue that muskets were worse in this regard. A more valid claim would be that at extremely long ranges, drag would reduce the velocity of the aerodynamically inefficient ball to the point where it would no longer be that effective, although this logic would apply to arrows to some extent, but Weigley fails to provide that nuance. And as for the claims that longbows were much superior in range and accuracy, these are often done by comparing the theoretical range of the longbow in perfect conditions with the effective range of the musket in combat. If one were to compare theoretical ranges, a Spanish musket ball could technically reach about 600 yards if the weapon were fired at a 45-degree angle, as argued by Barnabe Rich, which exceeds the theoretical range of the longbow of about 200–400 yards. Effectiveness would be quite low for both of these weapons at their respective maximum ranges. It is also worth mentioning that there is some evidence presented by Miclodes to present that longbowmen did not actually arc in combat, meaning that they really only loosed their arrows at ranges of less than 100 yards. In actual battle, it was noted by the French soldier Blaize de Montluc in 1545, for example, that the arquebusers under his command were told to wait until the enemy longbowmen could loose their arrows, which he said to be of little reach and threat compared to their allied Italian arquebusers. And Humphrey Barwick noted in 1594 that he saw few people slain by arrows, while he saw many killed by musketry. These viewpoints were far from uncommon, with many military leaders and veterans fiercely arguing for the complete adoption of the musket. Indeed, it's worth noting that the debates of the late 16th century involved not the question of whether to use longbows over muskets, but whether to use longbows at all. If longbows were superior to muskets in all of these regards as Weigley claims, then the English would have still kept an elite contingent of longbowmen. The European continent's most renowned infantry of the Middle Ages, the Swiss pikemen, had the good fortune never to confront a strong force of English longbowmen in battle. If they had, the English archers would have mowed them down. Not sure if the claim that they never fought is true. However, I can think of some scenarios where the pikemen come out on top, and also some others where the archers do win, so it isn't as lopsided as the excerpt implies. But against the first firearms, the Swiss merely dropped to the ground while the bullets passed over their heads, then resumed the advance while the enemy reloaded. Technically, it's possible that this strategy was used by the Swiss pikemen against arquebusers, as it may have occurred without being noted in the historical record. However, I haven't seen any strong evidence that supports the occurrence of this practice. And from a logical perspective, it doesn't make much sense either. If the Swiss tried dropping down after the arquebusers fired, it wouldn't work because the muzzle velocity of the bullets, technically balls, would simply be too high. If the Swiss were to instead drop down before the arquebusers fired, the latter would adjust their aim accordingly. Additionally, the actual advance would be significantly slowed down by continuously dropping into a prone position, thereby limiting the effectiveness of the overall attack. What we do see in the actual historical record is that Swiss pikemen were generally quite vulnerable to arquebusers, as shown by the battles of Biacca and Cerinola that took place during the Italian Wars. In the former battle, it is known that the gunners wiped out all of the standards of the Swiss as well as their first four ranks. And in the latter battle, they were able to effectively deal with both the French heavy cavalry and the Swiss pikemen, which is a far cry from the image of inflexibility and ineffectiveness that Wegley portrays. The regression in infantry missile firing was tolerated largely because a man could become acceptably adept in handling an arquebus or musket much more quickly than he could learn to handle a longbow or crossbow properly. While it is true that it took years for an individual to develop the physical strength necessary to use the longbow properly, especially one with a heavy draw weight, it does not necessarily mean that the musket was easier to train with. The process of reloading the musket was a tedious one with many steps, all of which were necessary to ensure that the user's hands didn't blow up or worse. And early musketeers tended to be well-trained and well-drilled, a far cry from the conception of massive armies composed of untrained conscripts, which to my understanding wouldn't really be a common thing in Western Europe until the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. It is also important to note that out of all the contemporary sources advocating for the complete adoption of firearms, literally none make the argument that musketeers were easier to train. In fact, many of these sources emphasize the importance of having well-trained musketeers. If this advantage were actually important, and the only one, as Wegley and others claim, then arguments in favor of firearms would have been using that point quite substantially. But the reality is that they did not.
Where the hell are you from?
The closest argument actually used was that firearms were more versatile in terms of physical strength. In other words, while musketeers would still be somewhat effective despite fatigue, archers would be devastated by their want of energy, given that the bow is more reliant on the user's physical strength than the musket is. However, this argument is still quite different from the popular argument that muskets were only adopted because they were easier to train. Skill in archery usually required constant practice from early boyhood, and the decline of the English longbowman was as much a social as a military phenomenon, involving the decline of England's independent agricultural yeomanry in the face of the first enclosure movement. Fortunately, this part is the least inaccurate one of the passage. There is some evidence to suggest that societal changes in England did affect the quality and quantity of English longbowmen, as lamented by defenders of the longbow such as John Smythe, and the claim makes sense from a theoretical perspective. So perhaps the miserable performance of the 16th century may have less to do with the musket's superiority, and more to do with larger societal